Many in Spain are still convinced that it began in 1936 with General Franco's nationalist rising to overthrow the Spanish Republic. Some historians extend the conflict even further, arguing over the long war of the 20th century. Did it last from 1914 to 1945, or from the Russian Revolution in 1917 until the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1989? Most people see the Second World War as a monstrous state-on-state clash between the major powers. Yet it was also an international civil war, especially affecting those countries which had been occupied. The fact is that the Second World War was a conglomeration of many different conflicts. And it's also worth remembering that it suddenly brought world history together, not just because of the global reach of the war, but because of its consequences in dramatically accelerating the end of imperialism and colonialism throughout Africa and Asia. I don't start the story with the Nazi invasion of Poland, as you might have expected. I begin a month earlier, in August 1939, when the Japanese army in Manchuria clashed with the Red Army on the Mongolian border at the river of Khalkhin-Gol. In comparison with the vast engagements which came later, this battle was comparatively small, but it influenced the whole course of the war. General Zhukov, in his first combat command, inflicted such a defeat on the Japanese that they decided not to attack north against Siberia, as many senior Japanese army officers wanted. Instead, the Imperial Japanese Navy would later prevail in its plans to attack south against British and Dutch possessions and American Pacific bases. It also meant that in the early winter of 1941, the Japanese refused to help when the Germans asked them to attack the Soviet Far East, to tie down the Siberian armies of Stalin as the Wehrmacht advanced on Moscow. The conflict stretched from the North Atlantic to the South Pacific, from the snowfields of Norway to Finland to the Libyan desert, from jungle fighting in Burma and on the islands and atolls of the Pacific Rim to SS Einsatzgruppen in the borderlands and Gulag prisoners drafted into punishment battalions. For those involved in the fighting in one place, battles on the other side of the world could have been taking place on another planet. And when it came to the unspeakable cruelties of the Sino-Japanese War, they could have been taking place in the Dark Ages. In the Far East, well over 15 million Chinese died at the hands of the Japanese. And this is, according to Rana Mitter, and also to Richard Frank, who's preparing a major work on the Pacific and Sino-Japanese War. Some Chinese historians claim that the true figure is far higher, even 40 million. But I think this is rather suspect, rather in the way that some Russian historians tried to push the Soviet Union's losses to a similar level on the basis of the consequent reduced birth rate after the war. We think of the appalling treatment of Western prisoners of war in the Far East, on the Burma Railway and so forth. Yet local populations endured far worse and incomparably more die. On the Burma Railway itself, a third of Allied prisoners of war died, but well over half the local forced laborers perished. Today it's very hard to appreciate the huge historical forces which killed some 60 to 70 million people. When we dwell on the enormity of the Second World War and its victims, we try to absorb all those statistics of national and ethnic tragedy. The Poles lost nearly 6 million people, almost a fifth of their population in the Second World War. And this was proportionally even higher than the Soviet Union, although in Belarus, the losses went up to a quarter of the population and accounted for a significant proportion of the 16 million Soviet civilians who died. Reliable estimates of total Soviet losses, both military and civilian, now vary between 24 and 26 million dead. Stalin knew in 1945 that they exceeded 20 million, but he tried to conceal this. In the words of Professor David Reynolds, he settled for 7.5 million as a figure that sounded suitably heroic, but not criminally homicidal. The statistics of suffering and the sheer size of the numbers are dangerously numbing, as the writer Vasily Grossman instinctively understood. In his view, the duty of survivors was to try to recognize the millions of ghosts from the mass graves as individuals, not as nameless people in the caricatured categories, because that sort of dehumanization was precisely what the perpetrators had tried to achieve. But focusing on the dead makes us overlook the way that the Second World War changed even the lives of survivors in ways impossible to predict. In the Archives Nationales in Paris, I came across a short paragraph in a June 1945 report by the French security police, the DST. This recorded that a German farmer's wife had been found in Paris having somehow smuggled herself onto a train returning French deportees from concentration camps in Germany. And it transpired that she'd had an illicit affair with a French prisoner of war assigned to their farm in Germany, while her husband was on the Eastern Front. And she'd fallen so much in love with this enemy of her country that she'd followed him to Paris, where she was picked up by the police. And that was all the detail provided, as I say, a very, very small paragraph. And these few lines raised many questions. Would her difficult journey have been in vain, even if she'd not been picked up by the police? Had her lover given her the wrong address because he was already married? And had he returned home, as quite a few did, to find that his wife had had a baby in his absence by a German soldier? A recent book in France estimated that nearly 100,000 babies had been fathered by German soldiers during the occupation. In any case, the bare bones of the story could almost have been a novel by Marguerite Duras. It is, of course, a tiny tragedy in comparison to the horrors of the Eastern Front. But it remains a poignant reminder that the consequences of decisions by leaders such as Stalin and Hitler ripped apart the certainty of the traditional fabric of existence. Many aspects are not as they appear on the surface, as I've certainly learned over the years. I remember as a young officer in Germany, based next door to Belsen concentration camp, being horrified there by a memorial to the French Jews who died. It stated, "Aux Juifs français qui sont morts pour la gloire et la patrie." I found the idea of French Jews dying for glory and the fatherland quite grotesque in such circumstances. And many years later, I mentioned this to the French historian Henri Rousseau, and he replied, "I entirely understand your reaction, but you're completely wrong." It was the French Jews themselves who insisted, after the war, that the memorials to their dead should have exactly the same wording as those of all other French. And this was because they would never forgive the Vichy regime for having tried to take away their French citizenship. The conditions under which men fought were so desperate that today we can hardly imagine how they survived. Even many who were there look back in amazement. One Red Army officer, Vladimir Ivanovich Tulyanev, said recently, "Nowadays, I can't believe that we were able to live in the trenches, in the open field, on the snow, in the cold, never taking off our shoes or clothes, with no water or source of heat. How on earth did we survive all that?" Between 1941 and 1945, many Red Army soldiers, those who survived the battles along the way, fought and marched for more than 12,000 kilometers. Soldiers, afraid both of the enemy and of execution by their own side, were put under a terrible psychological pressure. They and Soviet civilians were crushed pitilessly between the two totalitarian regimes. Red Army snipers at Stalingrad, for example, were ordered to shoot starving Russian orphans who'd been tempted with crusts of bread by German infantrymen to fill their water bottles in the Volga. The proud brutality of Soviet commanders is simply unimaginable in Western democratic societies. When it came to ruthlessness, General Zhukov even exceeded his master, Stalin. On the 4th of October 1941, Zhukov, as commander of the Leningrad front, issued the following order: to make clear to all troops that all families of those who surrendered to the enemy would be shot. Ironically, it did not occurred to Zhukov when he issued this order that under it, Stalin himself was in theory liable to execution, since his son Yakov Zhugashvili had recently surrendered to the Germans. I don't think that Stalin was unduly worried. He simply admired Zhukov for his pitiless determination. But even Zhukov, who'd sent virtually unarmed militia to their certain death against German panzer divisions in 1941, had no idea of the cynical sacrifice of all, in fact, in November 1942, which was carried out in his name. While Operation Uranus, the great plan to encircle Paulus's Sixth Army at Stalingrad, was being prepared, another offensive, a huge diversion, took shape much further north on the Kalinin and Western fronts against the German Ninth Army, and this was called Operation Mars, and was the subject of a book by David Glantz. Glantz, unable to access the key documents, became utterly convinced that Mars was a genuine operation like Uranus at Stalingrad. But in fact, the main objective of Mars was to ensure that not a single German division could be moved from the central part of the front to the southern part. But according to General Pavel Suvodoplatov of the NKVD, the ruthlessness was quite extraordinary. He described how details of Operation Mars were deliberately passed in advance to the Germans. The NKVD and GRU military intelligence had prepared what was called Operation Monastery, which was an infiltration of the German Abwehr intelligence department. Alexander Demyanov, the grandson of the leader of the Kuban Cossacks, had been instructed by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, to allow himself to be recruited by German military intelligence. And since his family was already well known in white émigré circles, the Germans had already identified him during the Nazi-Soviet pact as a possible agent for them. In early November, preparations were well advanced for Operation Uranus around Stalingrad and for the diversionary attack of Operation Mars near Rzhev. Alexander Demyanov was now instructed by his NKVD controllers to give the Germans details of Mars. The disinformation planted through Alexander, wrote General Sudoplatov, the NKVD chief of administration for special tasks, was kept secret even from Marshal Zhukov and was handed to me personally by General Fedor Fedotovich Kuznetsov of GRU in a sealed envelope. Zhukov, not knowing that this disinformation game was being played at his expense, paid a heavy price in the loss of thousands of men under his command. This was an understatement. This diversion cost the Red Army 215,674 casualties, just about the same as the total Allied casualties for D-Day and the whole of the Battle for Normandy. It was one of the most heartless sacrifices known in the history of war. Much has been written about the fighting qualities of the different armies in the Second World War, especially the difference between the armies of dictatorships and the armies of democracies. Much less has been said, on the other hand, about their similarities if one studies the performance of average as opposed to elite troops. Contrary to some of the wilder theories of combat performance, the evidence indicates that only a small proportion of frontline troops actually engage in combat. An initial study in the British Army was carried out in Italy by Major Lionel Wigram. And Wigram estimated that in most platoons of 30 men, roughly only a small handful really did the fighting. Another small group of men were likely to run away at the first opportunity. And those in the main group in between would follow the fighters if things went well, or the potential deserters if they went badly. General Montgomery was so horrified by the report that he had it suppressed. The Germans, at the same time, sort of divided their soldiers' combat performances into four categories, which actually were very similar. Die Einsatzfreudigen, those who enjoy fighting. Die Einsatzwilligen, those prepared to fight. Die Einsatzgehemmten, those reluctant to fight. And die Einsatzflüchtigen, those who will flee from their duty. So it's basically the same as Wigram's breakdown. The American combat historian, Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, went into the subject in much greater detail soon after the war. And even though some of his research has been shown to be dubious, there can be little doubt about the overall thrust that only a minority of soldiers in a conscript army shoot at the enemy. I was intrigued to find in the Russian archives that the Red Army was no different. Soviet officers argued during the war that a weapon inspection should be carried out immediately after an engagement with the enemy. All those found to have clean barrels should be executed immediately as deserters. Previously unpublished letters and diaries of the time give us an idea of personal experiences, but they also reveal the attitudes and mentalities holding sway at the time. German officers and soldiers, for example, felt that the Wehrmacht was invincible at the start of the war. It never seemed to occur to them that the war which they were bringing so pitilessly to other countries might one day turn back against them and destroy their own homes and families. Their triumphalism in the conquest of France in 1940 was buoyed up by relief that this war on the Western Front was completely unlike the battles of attrition a generation earlier during the First World War. As their panzer spearheads charged on towards the Channel through deserted countrysides, refueling their tanks at abandoned petrol stations and from French army fuel dumps, the tank crews in their black uniforms cheered their commanders whenever they saw them. There are many, many divisions here who haven't fired a shot, a corporal in the 1st German Infantry Division wrote home. And at the front, the enemy are running away. French and English, equal adversaries in the World War, refuse to take us on now. We haven't seen an enemy aircraft, only our own. Just imagine. Positions like Amiens, Léon, Chemin des Dames are falling within hours. In 1914 to 1918, they were fought over for years. The face of war is dreadful, a German soldier from the 269th Infantry Division wrote home. Towns and villages shot to pieces, plundered shops everywhere. Valuables are trodden on with jackboots, cattle are drifting abandoned, and dogs are slinking despondently along the houses. We live like gods in France. If we need meat, a cow is slaughtered, and only the best cuts are taken and the rest is discarded. With our rifles in our hand, we then break into a house and our hunger is sated. Terrible, isn't it? But one gets used to anything. Thank God that these conditions don't prevail at home. The idea that the Führer had spared Germany such horrors, a typical confusion of cause and effect, became a constant refrain in soldiers' letters. That attitude only changed 4 years later when retribution approached. In the spring of 1941, German soldiers had another rush of military arrogance when they invaded Yugoslavia and Greece. A member of the SS Das Reich wondered, did the Serbs believe that with their incomplete, old-fashioned and badly trained army that they could form up against the German Wehrmacht? That's just like an earthworm wanting to swallow a boa constrictor. The thrill of easy victory was expressed by one German officer in the 11th Panzer Division who wrote to his wife, if I saw the enemy, I would fire at them and always experienced a wild, genuine pleasure in fighting. It's a joyous war. We are suntanned and certain of victory. It's a wonderful thing to belong to such a division. And a Hauptmann captain with the 73rd Infantry Division reflected that peace would come even to the Balkans with a new European order, so that our children would experience no more war. Immediately after the first German units drove into Athens on the 26th of April, 1941, a huge red swastika flag was raised over the Acropolis. Preparations for the massive assault on the Soviet Union prompted similar hopes of rapid victory. Forests of birch and fir along the Soviet-Nazi frontier concealed vehicle parks, tented headquarters, and signal regiments, as well as fighting units. Officers briefed their men, reassuring them that it would only take 2 to 3 weeks to crush the Red Army. The unnatural alliance of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was over. Early tomorrow morning, wrote a soldier in a mountain division, we're off, thanks be to God, against our mortal enemy Bolshevism. For me, a real stone has fallen from my heart. Finally, this uncertainty is over, and one knows where one is. I am very optimistic, and I believe that if we can take all the land and raw materials up to the Urals, then Europe will be able to feed itself, and it will not matter how long the war at sea lasts. A single NCO in an SS division was even more confident. My conviction is that the destruction of Russia will take no longer than in France, and then my assumption of getting leave in August will still be correct. A fierce sense of relief also affected Soviet citizens, that this treacherous attack had released them from that unnatural alliance with Nazi Germany. The young physicist Andrei Sakharov was later greeted by an aunt in a bomb shelter during a Luftwaffe raid in Moscow. For the first time in years, she said, I feel like a Russian again. This war of annihilation, as Hitler called it, was pitiless. The Russian is a tough opponent, wrote a German soldier. We take hardly any prisoners and shoot them all instead. When marching forward, some took pot shots for fun at crowds of Red Army prisoners being herded back to makeshift camps, where they were left to starve in the open. Thousands of Soviet citizens died in the bombing of the cities of Belarus. Survivors fared little better in their attempts to escape eastwards. After Minsk began to burn, Vasily Grossman noted, blind men from the home for invalids walked along the highway in a long file, tied to one another with towels. Beyond the repression and starvation of ordinary Soviet citizens lay the far darker forces of Himmler's Einsatzkommandos, the killing squads. One day, a German transport corporal, accompanied by their company clerk, happened to see men, women, and children with their hands bound together with wire being driven along the road by SS men. They went to see what was happening. Outside the village, they saw a 150-meter trench dug 3 meters deep. Hundreds of Jews had been rounded up. The victims were forced to lie in the trench in rows so that an SS man on each side could walk along, shooting them with captured Soviet submachine guns. Then people were again driven forward, and they had to get in and lie on top of the dead. At that moment, a young girl, she must have been about 12 years old, cried out in a clear, piteous, shrill voice, "Let me live, I'm still only a child." The child was grabbed, thrown into the ditch, and shot. Only a very few managed to escape these killing pits. On the northeastern edge of Ukraine, Vasily Grossman encountered one of them. A girl, he wrote in his notebook, a girl, a Jewish beauty, who's managed to escape from the Germans, has bright, absolutely insane eyes. By the spring of 1944, the situation had changed completely. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat. Red Army soldiers advancing westwards had much to avenge. Our car passed the body of a woman lying in the snow, an Australian war correspondent noted near Veliki Luki. Our driver did not stop. Such sights are so common in the Russian war zone. The woman, who'd probably fallen out of line while being marched to Germany, had been shot or died of cold. Who will ever know who she was? She was just one of many million Russians. To Bobruisk led the road of revenge, wrote a war correspondent with the Soviet armies in Operation Bagration. With difficulty, our car finds its way between scorched and distorted German tanks and self-propelled guns. Men are walking over German corpses. As the Wehrmacht's retreat continued, nervous breakdown became a much more open subject in letters home to Germany. Psychologically, wrote a gunner, I'm finding it increasingly hard to manage when you've just been having a good chat with a comrade, and then half an hour later you see him as little more than scraps of flesh, as if he'd never existed. Or comrades who are lying badly wounded in front of you in a large pool of their own blood and beg you with pleading eyes to help them, because in most cases they cannot speak anymore. That is terrible. This war is a crushing war of nerves. When, in April 1945, the German front line began to break east of Berlin on the line of the Oder, traumatized survivors ran back, shouting, Der Ivan kommt. Further back, local farmers and their families also started to flee. Refugees hurry by like creatures of the underworld, wrote a young soldier. Women, children, and old men surprised in their sleep, some only half-dressed. In their faces is despair and deadly fear. Crying children holding their mothers' hands look out at the world's destruction with shocked eyes. As Berliners awaited the arrival of the Red Army, people prepared to meet their conquerors in different ways, either frivolous or tragic. In the Adlon Hotel, staff and customers listened to the sound of artillery shells. In the dining room, wrote a Norwegian journalist, the few guests were overwhelmed by the readiness of waiters to pour the wine in a constant stream. They did not want to leave any for the Russians. On the other hand, some fathers, as they left to join their Volkssturm unit to defend Berlin, thought only of the fate awaiting their families. It's all over, my child, one told his daughter, handing her his pistol. Promise me that when the Russians come, you will shoot yourself. He then kissed her and left. Others killed their wives and children and then committed suicide themselves. In the Far East, before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Malaya, the appalling complacency and racial arrogance of colonial society had produced a dangerous self-deception. Almost nobody had bothered to study the lessons of the Sino-Japanese War. And it must be said, neither had Hitler, who'd failed to see the very relevant lessons for his own invasion of the Soviet Union 4 years later. The shock and awe of cruelty doesn't always stun your opponent into submission. It can also provoke him into desperate resistance. And if he has a large landmass to withdraw into, a numerically inferior invading army, however excellent and well-armed, will fail to achieve a decisive victory. In any case, the British fatal underestimation of the Imperial Japanese Army included the idea that all Japanese soldiers were very short-sighted and inherently inferior to Western troops. In fact, they were immeasurably tougher, far more mobile, and astonishingly self-sufficient. They did not need breaching equipment. Their soldiers cut thick bamboos, then threw themselves in pairs into the river and bent forward with the bamboos running from shoulder to shoulder in parallel to form a bridge for their comrades to run over. Japanese soldiers had been brought up in a militaristic society. Their mothers would lovingly prepare a so-called 1,000-stitch scarf for them to wear, supposedly to ward off bullets. The whole village or neighborhood, paying homage to these martial values, would usually turn out to bid farewell to a conscript departing to join the army. Soldiers dreaded disgracing their family and community, and this, according to most Japanese historians, was far more powerful than any of those ideas of dying for the emperor. Their basic training was designed to destroy individuality. Recruits were constantly insulted, slapped, and beaten by their sergeants and corporals to toughen them up. In what might be called the knock-on theory of oppression, this treatment was also intended to provoke them to take their anger out in turn on the soldiers and civilians of a defeated enemy. All of them had also been indoctrinated since elementary school to believe that the Chinese were totally inferior to the divine race of Japanese and were in fact below pigs. One Japanese soldier admitted that although he'd been horrified by the gratuitous torture of a Chinese prisoner, he'd asked to be allowed to take part to make up for some perceived insult. During the so-called Rape of Nanking in December 1937, Japanese officers made Chinese prisoners kneel in rows and then practiced beheading them one by one with their samurai swords. Their soldiers were also ordered to carry out bayonet practice on thousands of Chinese prisoners bound up or tied to trees. Any soldiers who refused were beaten severely by their NCOs. The Imperial Japanese Army's process of dehumanizing its troops was stepped up as soon as they arrived in China from the home islands of Japan. A Corporal Nakamura, who had himself been conscripted as a soldier against his will, described in his diary how they'd made some new recruits watch as they tortured 5 Chinese civilians to death. The newcomers were horrified, but Nakamura wrote, "All new recruits are like this, but soon they will be doing the same things themselves." Their commanders, imbued with a sense of racial superiority and convinced of Japan's right to rule over East Asia, remained impervious to the fundamental contradictions that their war was supposed to free the region from Western tyranny. The Japanese army's treatment of conquered populations and defeated enemies dazed Westerners who'd never imagined such cruelty in modern times. Japanese officers talked of samurai honor, which called, in fact, for the generous treatment of the defeated, yet they never practiced it. They claimed that they were liberating Asia from Western colonialism, yet practiced a far worse oppression themselves, which led to famine and economic collapse in every country they occupied. John Rabe, the German businessman from Siemens, who courageously organized a safety zone in Nanking, wrote in his diary, "I am totally puzzled by the conduct of the Japanese. On the one hand, they want to be recognized and treated as a great power on a level with European powers. On the other, they are currently displaying a crudity, brutality, and bestiality that bears no comparison except with the hordes of Genghis Khan." Imperial Japanese Navy pilots would play bridge together in what they thought was a respectful imitation of Royal Navy officers in the wardroom. But they would behead any shot-down American pilot pulled from the sea. Japan in the 1930s was a dangerous combination of ancient culture and parvenu power. I think that the discovery which shocked me the most when researching this book was that Japanese officers did not merely condone but actively encouraged cannibalism, especially towards the end of the war. And these were not isolated cases. A similar pattern was found across the army in China and Pacific garrisons who were being cut off from supplies by the US Navy. It became clear from all the reports collected later by the American authorities and the Australian War Crimes Section that the widespread practice of cannibalism by Japanese soldiers in the Asia-Pacific War was something more than merely random incidents perpetrated by individuals or small groups subject to extreme conditions. The testimonies indicate that cannibalism was a systematic and organized military strategy. Both locals and Allied prisoners of war, especially those who remained loyal from the Indian Army, were kept alive as human cattle and then butchered for their meat one by one. Allied authorities, understandably afraid of the horror this would cause to the families of those who died in prison camps, decided to suppress the facts entirely. And as a result, cannibalism never featured at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in 1946. The British Army, reeling from the humiliation of losing Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Burma, was not in a frame of mind to fight back for some time. And only in 1944, under General Bill Slim's impressive leadership, did morale really improve, and the belief developed that they could outfight the Japanese. In the Pacific War, meanwhile, there was a marked difference in method and combat effectiveness between the US Marine Corps and the United States Army. The Marines believed in aggression and rapidity of attack. The Army was much more bureaucratic and ponderous. And the first step in island hopping came in August 1942 with the 1st US Marine Division's attack on Guadalcanal. The Japanese, horrified at the American landing and seizure of the airfield there, sent in a regiment to deal with the problem, not appreciating how strong the Marine force was. On the night of the 21st of August, their commander, Colonel Ichiki, ordered his men, around 1,000 strong, to attack through a mangrove swamp. And the Marines on the far side of a creek were waiting for them. So under the deathly green light of illuminating flares, they massacred the charging Japanese with machine guns and anti-tank guns firing canister. "The fever was on us," wrote a Marine of their bloodlust, and only a few of the Japanese broke through, but they were soon gunned or hacked down. The Marines then launched a flanking attack with a reserve battalion. Some of the Japanese threw themselves into the channel and swam away from the grove of horror, the same Marine continued. They were like lemmings, they could not come back. Their heads bobbed like corks on the horizon. The Marines lay on their bellies in the sand and shot them through the head. More than 800 Japanese out of the 1,000 had been killed. Marine souvenir hunters stripped the fly-infested bodies of anything which might be worth bartering later with sailors of the US Navy who were desperate for war trophies. A Japanese rising sun flag, known as a meatball, went for a dozen large Hershey chocolate bars, while a samurai's sword fetched 3 dozen. Crocodiles soon congregated to feast on the Japanese corpses, and the Marines, huddled in their gun pits under the rain, listened to the crunching in the dark with mixed feelings. The Japanese then landed 2 more forces, one of divisional strength, but the Marines, even when outnumbered, inflicted devastating casualties. Japanese commanders, ashamed of not achieving success the first time, would launch suicidal banzai charges to wipe out the dishonor. The Marines who longed for the Japs to do a banzai just gunned them down. It was the quickest way of finishing a battle against soldiers who would be far harder and more dangerous to winkle out from defensive positions. In many cases, Japanese wounded often concealed a grenade to blow themselves up and any US Navy corpsman trying to give them first aid. And so from then on, the Marines always shot or bayoneted any of the wounded. Once the rainy season began, the downpours filled weapon pits and foxholes. Bearded men shivered, soaked to the skin for days on end, and they suffered from jungle rot. Patrols and skirmishes had to be carried out in rain so dense that visibility was drastically reduced. The great priority was to keep ammunition dry, and troops on both sides suffered from dysentery, malaria, dengue fever, and, of course, infected cuts and abrasions from jungle thorn. Marines found combat conditions even worse in subsequent island battles. Massive aerial and sea bombardment was no guarantee that their casualties could be reduced. The 2nd Marine Division suffered 3,000 casualties in 24 hours in November 1943 when taking the tiny atoll of Tarawa. And photos of Marine bodies rolling in the surf shocked the American public. When the Japanese were well dug in, having used the very hard wood of palm trunks to make their bunkers, they could inflict severe losses. But the Marines countered with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and armored bulldozers to bury them alive. Even flame-throwing tanks were used, which in a typical Marine description turned the Japanese defenders into a barbecued chicken. The more intelligent Japanese commanders, such as Lieutenant General Kuribashi on Iwo Jima and General Ushijima on Okinawa, made no attempt to oppose the landings, and they forbade their men to launch banzai charges and waste their lives. They fought from networks of tunnels and caves enhanced with concrete, sliding doors, iron doors, and even extractor fans to remove the cordite fumes. With well-protected field guns and machine gun positions and interlocking fields of fire, these were formidable defensive positions. And by March the 25th, 1945, when the battle for Iwo Jima ended, 6,821 Marines had been killed or mortally wounded, as well as another 19,217 severely wounded. Apart from 54 Japanese severely wounded taken prisoner, 2 of whom had committed suicide immediately, Kuriabashi's force of 21,000 men were all dead. On Okinawa, even some of the toughest Marines suffered from nervous collapse, mainly due to the accuracy of the Japanese mortar and artillery fire. Everyone suffered from thudding headaches from the noise of the guns and the explosions. At night, the Japanese would try to infiltrate their lines, so star shells or flares were fired continuously into the sky. Sentries needed to note the position of every corpse to their front, because Japanese soldiers, creeping forward during the night, would freeze and lie still, feigning death. But even Japanese soldiers were liable to suffer combat fatigue. They referred to paralyzing fear as losing your legs, or uncontrollable trembling as the samurai shakes. Unlike the US Marine Corps, the freshly arrived Army divisions were slow to adapt to Pacific Island combat. But the hatred felt by most US Marines and soldiers was hardened by Japanese suicidal resistance and knowledge of their inhumane treatment of prisoners. American troops, like British troops in Germany, in Burma, did not see their Japanese enemy as human. Men from the 1st Marine Division landing on New Britain at the time of Christmas were told by the commander, "Don't squeeze that trigger until you've got meat in your sights, and when you do, spill blood, spill yellow blood." Some Marines decapitated Japanese corpses in order to boil the head and sell the skull when they got home. On the 9th of May, 1945, when news of Germany's surrender reached the rifle companies of the 1st Marine Division on Okinawa, their reaction was, so what? They were exhausted and filthy, and everything around them stank. And as far as they were concerned, the war in Europe was indeed another war on another planet. After the savage fighting on Okinawa, there remained the even more dreadful prospect of invading the Japanese home islands of Honshu and Hokkaido, where soldiers and civilians alike were preparing to fight to the death with bamboo, spears, and suicide bomb satchel charges. None of the Marines, of course, then knew of the atomic bombs being prepared in such secrecy. No other period in history offers so rich a source for the study of moral choice, individual and mass tragedy, the corruption of power politics, ideological hypocrisy, the egomania of some commanders, betrayal, perversity, unbelievable sadism, but also self-sacrifice and unpredictable compassion. In short, the Second World War defies generalization. But was it a good war from the Allied point of view? As other historians have already emphasized, we sacrificed the freedom of the eastern half of Europe to save the western half from Nazism. I don't believe that there was any option in the circumstances, but it should certainly put paid to any triumphalism. Just a few weeks after the book had gone to the printers, I heard from a German friend that her sister's father-in-law had died. His most intense childhood memory came from January 1945 in East Prussia, when his mother took her children on foot across the frozen lagoon of the Frischeshafen to escape the indiscriminate vengeance of the Red Army. The ice began breaking up all around, with many people falling through to freeze and drown. Almost 70 years later, as he died, his last words were, "I can hear the cracking of the ice." In the mad scheme of such a war, human life was intensely fragile. Survival was totally unpredictable. Thank you very much. And if anybody's got any questions? In fact, I think there are some microphones, aren't there, somewhere? Oh, great. There we go. Yeah.
Hello, yes. Konstantin Werdelicke, Wolfson College. Thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. I had a question concerning the role of historians. You talked about so many stories that were sad, that were moving, that were uncomfortable even. When it comes to sensitive topics such as these, do you feel that historians should just approach them as a scholar, or do you feel that a historian should approach them with the intent, perhaps, of exposing that which is hidden or correcting that which is misconstrued?
Well, I don't think those are incompatible. I mean, correcting what's been misconstrued or discovering new material. I mean, I think it's terribly important that one's always pushing forward, if you like, the boundaries of knowledge in that particular way. And actually, there is always more to come out. I mean, the archives, one may think that after all these years and after all the books that have been published, you know, that the archives have been fully gleaned and all the rest of it. I remember Stéphane Courtois, the French historian, saying to me, in the fairly early days in the Moscow archives, he was estimating it would take about 20 years if he used his whole team of researchers on just this is the French Communist Party archives alone, which were in Moscow, in the RGASP, in the Russian State Archive for Social Political History. What is the duty of the historian? I mean, obviously a terribly important one. I believe it shouldn't go much further than basically trying to understand and conveying that understanding. It's certainly not the role of the historian to start making moral judgments. I think that should be left to the reader as far as possible. Now, there is always going to be the debate about, you know, there's the German attitude that history is a science. I think that's ridiculous. History can never be a science. It can never be tested in a laboratory or anything like that. History is a branch of literature. And I think actually that's been one great advantage for British historians, if you like, whether in Spain or in everywhere else, because the tradition of narrative history goes all the way back to 18th century and Gibbon and so forth. And as a result, you actually have, on the whole, thank goodness, very, very good writing by historians such as Ian Kershaw and all the rest of it, who have more or less followed that particular tradition, and, you know, Richard Evans as well. The German attitude of sort of, oh, it's all got to be analysis, 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 I think actually is a corruption of history, because you are seeing the way that, in fact, Joachim Fest attacked me over 4 pages in Spiegel saying Beevor has no leading thought. Well, if you've got a leading thought, you're just going to select the material to prove it. And I think that actually the most encouraging thing one can find as a historian is when you're in the archives and you're actually realizing that your previous assumptions were totally wrong, because that's indicating you've actually found something, I think, quite interesting. But anyway, no, I mean, I think everyone's going to have their own sort of views on that particular one. But I think on the whole that, as I say, British historians have been lucky being brought up in that particular tradition. I remember from Spain, when my Spanish publisher persuaded me into rewriting, completely rewriting, really, the very early book I'd done on the Spanish Civil War. And I said to him, surely, Gonzalo, the Spaniards are sick of having the Brits writing their history. And he said, no, you're totally wrong. He said that there is no general history written by a Spaniard. They're too scared to do it in many ways. They simply cannot in any way get that sort of objectivity. And also because that sort of very almost telescopic examination of sort of different aspects of their history doesn't, if you like, lend itself to anything that's sort of remotely readable. So that, I think, is sort of one aspect. Anyway, sorry, I'm going on rather a long time on that particular one. Let's have another question. Yeah, that's one there.
Hi. Chris Spiller, Trinity College. I was just wondering, given your previous answer, and as a historian both of the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War, what is your view on Paul Preston calling his recent book The Spanish Holocaust?
I've had a number of discussions with Paul over lunch and over on various other occasions, and including one bit of a spat, actually, at I think it was a great pity. And I'm not alone in having told him that. A lot of other people have, too. He took the whole thing sort of very personally and very emotionally. Now, no one's disagreeing with the figures. I mean, I think, if anything, I think probably the figures that I quoted in my book were slightly worse than Paul's. But I mean, you know, so that's not it. Where I think that he was very much at fault, and this is what he got sort of angry about, was the way that he would not accept the real danger that obviously we know about the horrors of the right. There's no doubt about that. We know roughly also about sort of, you know, roughly and how many were killed by the left, which was far, far fewer. But what he found very, very hard to accept, which was both Raymond Carr, Gerald Brennan, and others had demonstrated very clearly over the years, is that the winning side in any civil war is always going to kill far more than the losing side. But he simply would not accept that for a moment. And he refused to accept even the material that, you know, we were finding in the Russian archives, that not so much the left in Spain, but the Soviets were determined to take over the Spanish Republic if they won, obviously not if they lost, but if they won, and turn it into a satellite state, which would have been similar to the satellite states that we saw after the Second World War. And Paul found that sort of almost impossible to swallow. So anyway, no, we had some, shall we say, very friendly disagreements. We also had one or two slightly more pointed ones. But I do think it was a great mistake to actually use the phrase the Holocaust in that particular case. There was not the same, it was not a racial form of genocide. It wasn't even a genocide as such, because, as we know, there were still hundreds of thousands of prisoners who weren't killed. So I think that it was I think that was a sort of a major flaw. No, his biography of Franco is superb, and I think everyone has acknowledged that. And much of this book is a very, very important assembly of a lot of the research, as he acknowledges himself, done by lots of local historians in Spain, and it's terribly important to get that all together. So it's not a question of trying to knock the whole book by any means. Am I being let off? Oh, yeah, here we go. Good, right.
Chris Bray, Queen's College. So in your professional opinion, would you say that you obviously take the clear view that the German war was decisively really on the Eastern Front? So if they had captured Moscow or they had captured Stalingrad, do you believe they actually would have won the war decisively and it would have been over?
No. I think I can say that one fairly clearly. What was very interesting was there was that moment in October 1941 when Stalin panicked, and he was prepared. In fact, he called in Stamanov, the Bulgarian ambassador, to see if he could somehow negotiate or act as a go-between with Hitler. And Stalin was prepared to hand over Ukraine if that would sort of somehow save what he thought was the thing. And Stamanov said, with considerable wisdom, saying, but you're crazy. He said, even if you have to retreat all the way to the Urals, you will win in the end. Now, maybe Stamanov, this is going back to what I was saying in that thing, maybe Stamanov had actually looked at the lessons of the Sino-Japanese War and realized that, in fact, it was going to be the sheer size of the Soviet Union which would defeat the German army. Many German officers, particularly in the Abwehr, said our only chance of winning is if we manage to recruit an army of 1 million Ukrainians who will fight with us, i.e. if we turn this into a civil war. But Hitler, because of his racial obsessions, would not accept the idea of a Slav in Wehrmacht uniform. In fact, often his orders were being ignored at the front, but he simply, because he never visited the front, he had no idea that, in fact, most of his sort of edicts on race and the recruitment of former Soviet soldiers were in fact being ignored. But sorry, going back more specifically to your question, if they'd taken Moscow, yes, Moscow was an extremely important center of communications and also of arms industries. But even if they'd lost Stalingrad, funny enough, the fact of losing Stalingrad did not make that great a difference because the Volga was already cut. I mean, one of the reasons for sort of the defense of Stalingrad was always said, well, the Volga is the lifeline of the Soviet Union. Well, the Volga had already been cut by the Germans. They already controlled it by artillery in different places, further upriver and downriver. So that didn't really actually make that much difference. No, Stalingrad was symbolic. And in fact, Beria, Stalin's head of secret police, described it as a battle of rams, i.e. Hitler was determined to capture Stalingrad because it bore Stalin's name. And he, realizing that the key element, which was to capture the oil fields in the Caucasus, was failing to manage that. And he wanted then an ersatz, a replacement victory. And that's why he put the emphasis on Stalingrad. The original plan for Fall Blau, Operation Blue, did not include the capture of Stalingrad. This is why he changed it, purely so that the impression of capturing the city named after Stalin would be the equivalent of victory. Hitler, as we know, was always obsessed with symbols, and this was actually, of course, one of his great failings in that particular way. But as I say, neither the loss of Berlin nor the loss of Stalingrad would actually have made the difference. One can say, and this is the vital thing, there are several turning points in the Second World War. The first one comes in late May 1940, when the very fact that Churchill managed to persuade the rest of the cabinet that Britain should fight on, and he did not give in to Lord Halifax, who wanted to sound out the Italian ambassador to see what the terms might be for peace at that particular point. Because if Britain had made peace with Germany at that particular point, Hitler would have won, and there would have been nothing, the Americans wouldn't have been able to come in, there would have been nothing that could have been done. And so, the next turning point, of course, December 1941, that was the geopolitical turning point of the war. The entry of the Americans into the war with their vast industrial potential, and of course the fact that Hitler had failed at that particular point, which gave tremendous confidence and determination to the Red Army to fight on. So from that point, it was impossible to imagine Hitler actually winning the war. But I mean, then one must remember that the first part of 1942, all the way through until basically sort of September, October, was absolutely disastrous for the Allies. I mean, we were losing in North Africa, we were losing everywhere, and the Germans seemed to be triumphant. But then comes that moment, and this is why Stalingrad actually is the psychological turning point of the war, because it was quite clear from the determination of the Russians and the fact that they'd learned how to use basically Wehrmacht tactics in the huge encirclement at Stalingrad and all the rest of it, that they had got their confidence back. And in fact, they knew that from that point on that there were going to be a lot of hard fights still to come, but they would win the war. So that really is the psychological turning point from everybody's point of view. And actually, it was seen as such around the world. I mean, one's only got to remember, Pablo Neruda writing Homenaje a Stalingrado, one of sort of the great poems of the Second World War. It was seen as that real moment. And of course, it was also the moment it was also the act which turned Russia from a great power into a superpower. That was why Stalin at the Tehran conference was able to lay down his conditions, basically, to Roosevelt and to Churchill on what the strategy for the rest of the war was going to be. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering what you thought and how much significance you place on the Allied policy of a non-intervention in Spain during the Spanish Civil War to support the Republican government in relation to the outbreak of. I think it's,
yeah, I think we can.
In relation to the outbreak of the Second World War, and also kind of on from that, I know that kind of is quite like a counter. Oh, taken by surprise by that. It was kind of it's quite a counterfactual question. I also wonder what you think about counterfactual history and the validity that has, and how useful that can be. Thanks.
Right, try and do that one at a time. Non-intervention. I don't think that non-intervention, one can argue that non-intervention sort of lost the war for the Republic. If the Spanish Republic was going to defeat Franco, it had to be done in the first 3 weeks of the war. By that stage, non-intervention hadn't even started, really. So I think that Franco was, in fact, as soon as he was going to get support from the Axis, was probably bound to win, but also because he had a centralized power. He didn't have the splits on the Republican side. He had a professional army, and he also, above all, he had the Air Force and the Condor Legion, and the combination of all of that basically meant that in the long term he was going to win. So non-intervention, I don't think you can actually say made a vast difference in that way. I mean, it was pretty shameful from the British point of view. There we were setting ourselves up as sort of, the world policeman, and then basically turning a blind eye to what the Axis was doing, the Germans and the Italians were doing in arming Franco. Now, the fear at the time, and this one has to remember, was the fear at the time, and certainly of Antony Eden and all the others, was they were afraid that the Spanish Civil War was going to be the next Sarajevo. They felt that if they did not try to sort of isolate it and put it in a sort of cordon sanitaire and try to keep out any form of intervention, then the Spanish Civil War was going to drag the rest of Europe into war. So one's got to understand it slightly from that point of view as well. Counterfactual history. Well, I think that counterfactual history is terribly important purely in posing the questions. As soon as you go beyond that, you're playing a game. And frankly, I think it can be a sort of rather a misleading game if you try to take it more than say one step down the path. I mean, you could start playing, three-dimensional chess, if you like, in a way. And I think that's how it goes. I mean, there are certain historians. I mean, intriguingly, Neil Ferguson and Andrew Roberts both adore counterfactual history. I don't agree. I think that it's a distraction, but I do think that it's important to pose those questions, even if you can never answer them.
One military or political figure of any nation over the course of the war, who would you say was the best leader?
Well, the best leader in certain circumstances. I mean, okay, he was frankly a psychopath in other ways, but General Patton was obviously, for certain circumstances, i.e. sort of breakthrough, rapid attack, and all the rest of it. I mean, Patton really was seriously bonkers, dangerously bonkers in many ways, but sometimes, they can be brilliant in very, shall we say, limited circumstances. You wouldn't want him around in peacetime, and actually he didn't want to live in peacetime. You've only got to read his diaries. The whole time it was sort of, dear God, make sure that something kills me before the end of the war, because I can't face civilian life. Now, on the other hand, you then get people like Admiral Nimitz in the Pacific, a very modest man, very concerned for his own men, sailors, and on all of his ships. He was not a braggart. He wasn't like MacArthur. He wasn't like General Mark Clark. I mean, what did intrigue me a little bit while working on this book was to see, of course, that for the first time, many of these generals, and you have to remember, during the 1930s, nobody was really interested in any generals or admirals or anything like that. And then suddenly they become sort of film stars. And the reason for this is that the media, the journalists, the war correspondents, the movie-tone news or whatever it was, they can't give any details about what's really happening for security reasons. So all they can do is sort of focus on the character of the commander. And of course, they always have to build him up and all the rest of it. And of course, there are people like General Mark Clark, who always insisted on being photographed from one side because he was very proud of his profile, which he thought looked rather sort of Augustan and all the rest of it. In fact, his officers referred to him as Marcus Aurelius Clarkus, particularly because he was obsessed with the capture of Rome. Montgomery was another one who became completely obsessed with his own self-image and all the rest of it. And as I say, this was rather the trouble, that they were sort of built up in this way, and they started to believe their own myths, and then they confused the notions of charisma and leadership. So that was sort of a bit of a danger in that particular way. But that was very much on the sort of British and American side. None of that was allowed to happen on the German side. I mean, the only one who really got boosted in that way was Rommel, because Goebbels liked the idea that he was an ordinary soldier. He wasn't one of these sort of nasty aristocrats from the general staff. So he got the boosting, but very few other of the German commanders. And of course, that never happened in the case of the Soviet Union, except, of course, Zhukov started to attract a lot of attention. And that didn't do him very much good, because it made Stalin paranoid that he might lead a military coup afterwards. And in fact, he was actually accused formally of Bonapartism, which is an interesting one. Yep.
So I had two questions. My first question was whether you could share your opinion about whether Franco's regime can be thought of as a fascism. And the second one, if you could talk about the sort of current consensus in the number of casualties that happened in Guernica.
Such a long time, I'm afraid. I'm not going to be able to, I don't think I can be able to answer the Guernica one. I mean, as in many bombing cases, it seems that the figures were very much exaggerated at the time. And I can't remember off the top of my head what the revised figures are, but they were a lot lower than what Steer and others reported at the time. As for Franco and fascism, I think that there were, if you like, obviously there were fascist elements, particularly within the Falange. Franco himself wasn't a fascist as such. He was an utterly reactionary, sort of arch-Catholic dictator. He was certainly not the fascist in the sense of there was an element of cult of personality. That is certainly true. But that wasn't necessarily coming from him. He was an utterly unpleasant little man from the point of view that he was, even the Nazis actually were shocked by Franco's cruelty, which gives you a pretty good idea. There was a famous occasion when the German ambassador was having lunch with him during the Spanish Civil War, in fact in November 1936. And these militia women had been captured, and he recounted how an officer came in and said, "What are we supposed to do with all these militia women we've captured?" And Franco, without pausing, and as he was lifting the fork to his mouth, said, "Shoot the lot of them," and just carried on eating. So even, as I said, the Nazi ambassador was shocked by that. You've got to look at what then became the movement, El Movimiento, which was an element of different things. It was a mixture of Carlist, a mixture of Falangist, a mixture of monarchist. The point was, he was a brilliant manipulator. Franco was one of the worst generals imaginable, totally lacking in any form of imagination. But he was a brilliant political operator in the way that he was able to play off his enemies and rivals against each other and emerge well in front. So you cannot compare what became the movement to, for example, either the Nazi Party or even the Italian fascists in that particular way. So no, I would basically say no. I would say an extremely reactionary dictator rather than an actual fascist regime. I think we've got time for just one more. Well, it's always a difficult one because, frankly, the needs of Hollywood and the needs of history are totally and utterly incompatible. One of the things is, one of the staples of the Hollywood system, of course, is you have to have arc of character. Take Saving Private Ryan. Here we talk about, the characters from central screenwriting. You have the cynic reduced to tears. You have the coward who finds his courage again. In all of these cases, it is the arc of character. Now, that is the dramatic need of the movies. Now, there are one or two, I think, superb films which have been made. Obviously, the Battle of Algiers, La Bataille d'Alger, La 77e Section, which actually was a film set in the Indochina. Which in many ways actually was the start. I think it was picked up on by American things, and it was sort of in a way the start of the platoon movement. But when you look at the Second World War, most of them were either the sort of the rather bombastic British ones of the 1950s, Reach for the Sky and the Dam Busters and all the rest of it. Or later on, you have sort of, the American How We Won the War in the sort of Saving Private Ryan, which I was asked to review it by Newsweek, but my review was completely spiked. When it was seen to be, shall we say, less than... No, the beginning of the film was brilliant. The first 20 minutes was probably one of the best bits of sort of... But then afterwards, you had every single cliche you could possibly imagine. And I'm afraid rather depressing. I mean, to end up with sort of, the... survivor standing there in the cemetery with tears pouring down his cheeks, and the music is swelling, and you hear the sort of the drums and the sort of rather hymn-like music going on in the background, and saying to his wife, "Tell me I'm a good man." And you can see that she's supposed to be there to sort of, to reassure America that basically, it was a good war and all the rest of it. And interestingly, of course, those sort of films were made by filmmakers from the Vietnam era. They were part of that Vietnam generation. And what they loved about the Second World War, in a way, was sort of, this is the good war. We were wearing the white hats and so forth. Now, on the other hand, the Band of Brothers was quite a lot better, I think, in many ways. Partly, should we say, historically, it was much closer to the truth. You didn't have any of the stuff as you had in Saving Private Ryan, of... that ultimate cliche of sort of a mixed band of guys with improvised weapons defending a bridge, a vital bridge against an SS Panzer counterattack. I mean, Dirty Dozen could have been it, or any of the others. But no, I mean, the Band of Brothers was quite a bit better. There were, shall we say, there were a lot of sort of sentimentalizations, which one could have done without. But in sort of historical terms, it was quite a lot closer to the truth, both showing the shooting of prisoners by the Americans rather than trying to cover it up. Shall we say, the very strange relationships and the different sorts of officers that could happen, who could be, shall we say, dealt with quite often, sometimes by what's called fragging in the Vietnam War, when grenades were just chucked into their tents. You started to see a sort of not a black and white picture, or rather a completely white picture as one seen in the past. There were quite a few more shades of grey. But, in general terms, I'm afraid I'll go back to my original thing, the war movie and basically the historical movie. And I think the requirements of history don't really go very well together. Okay.